our principal thoughts belong to God, not to the world. Let us hold the profession of our faith without wavering. What will I do? I will fear no evil, for thou art
All right, again, it's good to see everybody here that's with us today. Visitors, we're glad you are here. Valen has her fiancé with her today, so we're glad that he's with us today. I said boyfriend, but I was corrected about that. So congratulations to them. Today's December 22nd, so Christmas is 3 days away, roughly. And so all week I've been excited to talk about this Christmas passage that we'll look at. So if you want to turn in your Bibles, let's go to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. And for time's sake, since we do have visitors here, and somebody said that I might preach over an hour, which is not true, by the way. I'll only get to cover verses 1 to 12. There's a little bit more to the story right there, but 1 to 12 is all we'll have time to cover. Unless you just want me to keep going, then we might do that. So let's look at the text and see what this says. So it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is so written by the prophet, 'And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel.' And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him.' And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." And so if you've looked at the church calendar for December, you might have noticed a quote at the bottom of our church calendar by Charles Spurgeon. It says, "The greatest and most momentous fact which the history of the world recorded is the fact of Christ's birth." And kings have always been celebrated since the beginning of time. Every time a king is born, there's a great celebration, for that child that'll be the future king. We saw that a few years ago when Prince William and Kate had their son George, I believe is his name. So that's always been celebrated. But we know that today that there is a war on Christmas. So the birth of this king for the majority of the world is not celebrated. In fact, there is a debate of if you can even say the word Christmas. We replace it with the word holiday. You don't have a Christmas tree, you have a holiday tree. You can't send a Christmas card, you have a holiday card. It really makes no sense. And so there is attack on the word. It's offensive to a lot of people. But I'm not going to go far into that because I didn't want to have a long introduction today because I want to make sure, I spend most of the time in dealing with this. But we know that there is a war on Christianity because of this king. So this is one king who is not celebrated by the majority of the world. Let's get right into this text and start with verses 1 and 2. And so it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, the wise men, the Magi, from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." And so we've got two players in the Christmas story here, in this passage, that Luke does not mention. Herod and the Magi, these wise men. And so before we get into the details of this particular passage, we don't tend to look at this passage as much as the Luke passage. Luke chapter 2. You can probably quote most of that passage about the birth of Christ in Luke 2. So, but before we get into this, there's something I want you to notice there at the beginning of the story. This takes place after Jesus had been born in Bethlehem. And so the wise men were not present, like we see in a lot of the pictures. They were not present at the stable at the birth of Jesus, like the shepherds were. So this is some time has passed here. Now Matthew, he doesn't tell us how much time has passed, and so I'm not going to speculate on that very much. But some time has passed, and so let's look at these two characters in these first two verses. We've got Herod, this man, and we have these wise men or Magi from the east. So let's start with Herod. Now there were several kings in the Bible, in the New Testament, named Herod. But this is the patriarch. This is the first of those kings, Herod the Great. We see that a lot of times in the ancient world. People attach adjectives to their names. Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, Herod the Great. There will not be an adjective on my tombstone when I die, unless it could be a bad one, I guess. But it's not going to say the Great, I can promise you. So without getting into his entire backstory, he was only a quote-unquote king because Rome allowed him to be a king. He was declared by Rome to be the king of the Jews in 40 BC. So he's been king a long time at this point. He's probably been king around 35 years at the time of the birth of Christ. But the ironic part is, Herod was not Jewish. He was king of the Jews, but he was not Jewish. He was Idumean or an Edomite. And Edom is south of Judah, south of the Dead Sea, if you look at it on a map. But he did marry a Jewish woman who was the high priest's daughter. So he married into a prominent Jewish family. To be more acceptable to the Jews is the idea behind that. Marriage is a lot of times when you're a king, you do for political reasons. And he did keep some Jewish customs publicly. And all of this was done, of course, for political reasons, like I said. But he oversaw massive building projects during his reign. Theaters, racetracks. He improved the water supply for Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. He did a lot of good things for the people in that regard. But his most famous building project was the renovation of the temple in Jerusalem. And that began in 19 BC. And it took several decades for that to be completed. That's why a lot of times you hear it called Herod's Temple. Because he started the massive renovation. Of course, he was doing that to try to be more appealing to the Jews as well. And so all that sounds good. There's nothing that I have described there that you would say, well, that sounds like a bad king. All of those sound like good things that he's trying to help the people. But Herod was a jealous man. He was paranoid, he was suspicious, and he was fearful about losing his position and power. From the very beginning of his reign, he was like this. So much so that he had the high priest killed in 35 BC, which was his brother-in-law. He was his wife's brother. Had him killed, and here's how he had him killed. He had him drowned at a party. And then he put on a massive funeral for the man and pretended to weep at his party after he was responsible for his death. But it doesn't stop there. He also killed his wife. And then he killed her mother. And then in 7 BC, which would be close to the timeline that we're at right now, he had 2 of his own sons killed. And then, just days before he died, he had a third son executed. And so you thought you might have come from a dysfunctional family. But I'm sure it's not like this one. You know, how's that Christmas card going to look every year when people get it? Well, you know, I thought some of Herod's kids, you know, they seem to be missing in this photo. What happened to them? Well, but many historians claim that Herod could not have done what happens in verse 16 of chapter 2. And if you know the story, if you look down there at verse 16, you'll see that that's where Herod has all of the young male children in Bethlehem killed, 2 years old and younger, to try to kill the Christ child. A lot of historians claim that that did not happen and it could not have happened. But I just relayed to you some information about Herod's history. Why is that doubted, knowing this man's past? In fact, Caesar Augustus, who we see in the Luke chapter 2 account, we know Caesar Augustus, he was the most successful emperor of Rome. He was the first emperor of Rome. His real name was Octavian, but he named himself Augustus. He said of Herod, and this is recorded by a Roman historian, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." And of course, Herod, you know, would not touch pork or eat pork because he was trying to keep some of the Jewish customs. That's from Caesar Augustus himself. It's better to be Herod's pig than his son. And so that's a little bit about Herod. That's who we're dealing with here. A man who is obsessed with his power, and now that he's getting older, he's obsessed with keeping it. But now let's turn our attention to maybe the most puzzling and mysterious people mentioned in the entire Bible. Who are the Magi? These wise men. And why are they here at the birth, or as a part of the birth of Jesus? Why are they there? And so I had to decide how far I'm going to go down this road, because I could probably just do a whole sermon on the history of the Magi to try to get you up to date. So I thought, well, this can't be over an hour like he claims. So I had to decide just what information I wanted to give you. So I tried to simplify it as much so you still get an idea of who they are and maybe an understanding of who they are and that kind of thing. So let's dispel some myths about the Magi first before we get into who they actually were. One myth is that they were three kings. You know, we have a Christmas carol about that. We three kings of Orient are bearing gifts, we've traveled so far. This kind of thing. Well, they weren't three kings. So first of all, they were not kings. So that's a myth. The Catholic Church that claims that they know their names and they have their skulls. So if you want to see the skulls of the wise men, you can go, if you ever visit Germany, you can go to the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, and you can see their skulls if they have them on display. But there's a problem with that because the cathedral in Milan claims they have them too. So somebody's got them, I guess. But the thing about that is, none of those stories originated until the Middle Ages. We're talking 1,000 years later before these stories ever came about. And so those are some of the myths associated with the Magi. Matthew does not tell us their names. He does not tell us what country where they were from. He also does not tell us how many there were. We get that tradition from the three gifts. So it's just assumed that there were three of them. I think there were probably more than three. That's just my personal opinion. But the Bible does not say how many. Now the country, it doesn't name a specific country either. It just says from the east is where they came from. Now that word east in the Greek text, it literally means a rising of the sun. That's what the word means, a rising of the sun. So they came from the east. So wherever that could be, there's really only one logical solution for it. These Magi, these wise men, they had to have come from the Parthian Empire, because that was the empire directly east of the Roman Empire, which Israel was pretty much the border, the far eastern border of that empire. And the Parthian Empire was the number one enemy of Rome at this time. These are the early days of the Roman Empire. And the Parthian Empire was their number one enemy, and it was to the east, which is interesting. In the previous 50 years before this event, Rome had fought 3 wars with Parthia over those 50 years. And in fact, Parthia had controlled this very area of Jerusalem and the Holy Land of what we call it, and Rome ran them out. And that's basically where Herod comes into play as far as becoming king of the area. And so there's a history here. Now, as far as geographically, if you still think, well, that Parthian Empire, 2,000 years ago, that doesn't mean anything to me. Geographically, it's basically the old Persian Empire, which is primarily the modern-day country of Iran. If you're familiar with the Middle East, Iran would have been the main country. There were other countries as well, but there's no need to go into all that. If you have a pretty good idea of where Iran is, then you have an idea of what the Parthian Empire was. And so these magi, the Greek word is magos, and it's plural. You say, well, where do we get that word magi? Well, in English, we borrowed it from Latin. And so we are using the Latin version of this word, magi. And so it is plural, but it's the name given by the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans, and the Medes and the Persians also kept this name. It was given to their wise men, their philosophers, their astrologers. They studied astrology. They studied the skies and the stars. That was really important to this group of people. They were considered physicians as well, interpreters of dreams. And they later became religious priests as well. In the Parthian Empire, we could call them religious priests. Now, there's speculation of where they came from or what their origin actually is. Some people claim that they go all the way back to the time of Abraham, that they were a nomadic tribe. But we don't know. But we do know that they first really appear in Babylon. And so we need to know the story. Israel has a history with Babylon, don't they? Because about 600 years prior to this, what happened? Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem, takes the last wave of captives back to Babylon, and all the kings of Israel, it's done away with. The temple's destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, and they're taken to Babylon in captivity. Daniel's there, we know. We have the story of the 3 Hebrew boys and Daniel. All that happened in Babylon, right? Well, that was about 600 years before the birth of Christ. The chief of the Magi was present with Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC when he destroyed Jerusalem. The chief of the Magi was there. You can see that in Jeremiah 39 and 3. If you read the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the word magos is used 8 times in the book of Daniel, in the Greek version of the Old Testament. And we know in Daniel chapter 5 that Daniel was named the chief of the Magi by Nebuchadnezzar. He gained great favor with Nebuchadnezzar. And why? Because these people could not interpret his dream. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream? But who interpreted the dream? Daniel interpreted the dream, which gained him great favor. And he was appointed chief of the Magi by Nebuchadnezzar. And then years pass. And Daniel is old. And he's brought in to interpret another dream by Belshazzar in chapter 5. No one else can interpret that dream. And then Daniel interprets it. And basically it's, okay, this is over. This empire is crumbling. And they're conquered by the Medes. And then the text says in Daniel 5 that Daniel was the 3rd most powerful man in the Median Empire. That didn't last long because the Persians basically conquered them and they merged. And that's why it's called the Medo-Persian Empire. And their great king, who was prophesied by Isaiah, Cyrus the Great, he started letting the Israelites come back to Israel in 3 different waves. And that's where we have the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so the connection with the Magi and this story, it has to come from Daniel. They would have had knowledge of these Hebrew scriptures from Daniel. That's the only thing that makes sense that they would know anything about a future king, because Daniel prophesied about a future king, did he? An anointed one, the Messiah. And so that seems to be where the connection might be between the Magi and this story. We also see the Magi mentioned in Esther, chapter 1, verse 13. We can see the Magi. And that would have been on down the road from Daniel and the Persian Empire. And so by this time, roughly 600 years later from all those events, by this time, this group, these Magi, they were extremely powerful in the Parthian Empire. In fact, you could not be king without the approval of the Magi. So to be the king of the Parthian Empire, you had to be approved by this group of people. And they were eventually called the king makers of the Parthian Empire. And so it's interesting that we have this group of king makers from a foreign land show up looking for a king. That's just interesting to me. The king makers of a foreign land. And so they show up in Jerusalem. And the text says that they're going around. Where is he who has been born? See, he's already born. King of the Jews. Where is he? So they reveal that they're looking for a king. And everybody in town would have known that these magi were there. I think it would have been hard to keep that secret. They were probably traveling with a large entourage. You know, a lot of times we see in the pictures, 3 guys coming in on camels by themselves. Well, that's not likely. Because if these were so influential in their kingdom, they would have had soldiers with them to guard them and protect them and everything else. So it wasn't just 3 guys who decided, hey, let's go on a road trip, to the west. Let's get our camels and go. So it would have been hard to keep this secret. The whole city would have known what was going on. And so they reveal their purpose, but they also state why they're looking for the King of the Jews. They say, we saw his star, and we've come to worship him. And so a group of Gentiles, these foreigners, have come to worship a king of the Jews. Now that's an interesting concept to think about for me. It's just an interesting concept. And of course we have this mysterious star in the story. And we'll talk about the star in just a minute. But let's look at the reaction at Jerusalem. What's going on in Jerusalem when these magi, these wise men show up? Well, here's what it says in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, this is toward the end of Herod's life. He became king of the Jews in 40 BC. It's speculated. We don't know exactly what year Jesus was born, but we do know when Herod died. There's a little bit of debate about his death. Most people say he died in 4 BC. But some people say 1 BC. So we don't know for sure. But Herod is older now. And he's even more paranoid in his later years than he was in his younger years. And so it says that he's troubled. Now that word from the Greek text, here's what it means. It means an inward commotion. To take away the calmness of the mind. To strike one's spirit with fear or dread. To render anxious or distressed. Now, it's obvious why Herod would be distressed at this news, right? That's not hard to figure out. He is supposed to be king of the Jews. At least until he can pass it on to one of his sons, unless he kills them all first. So he's supposed to be king of the Jews. And what's the number one priority of a king? The number one priority of a king is not to take care of his subjects. It's to keep his power. That's the number one priority of a king in his mind, is to keep his power. And that is what is troubling him. And remember, Herod's not Jewish. He's not Jewish. He has the title King of the Jews. And he's hearing this information from men who are a part of Rome's number one enemy at the time. So think about that. I'm the king, and powerful people from our number one enemy has showed up to my city. And they're telling me they're looking for a king of the Jews when I'm supposed to be king of the Jews? Oh yeah, Herod was stressed about this big time. But then here's the part of the text that caught my attention this time, reading through it, that I think we overlook a lot. It says all Jerusalem was troubled with them. Do you see that? It says Herod's troubled. We understand that. That's obvious. But why is all of Jerusalem troubled about this? Why would that be? That everybody in the city is nervous or anxious about these men here looking for a king. Aren't the Jews supposed to be looking for the Messiah? Shouldn't this be good news? And so what could be some theories behind that? Well, like I said, if these people are from Parthia, which I think that's most likely, maybe the citizens think, hey, we know who these guys are. These are king makers. and they've showed up in our city? Are they bringing war with them? Are we about to go to war? Caesar Augustus is old at this point. The great Augustus, he's old. Herod's old. So now would be the perfect opportunity for them to come to swipe in and take this territory back. So are they bringing war? Do we need to get out of the city? What's going to happen? Maybe that's the reason all Jerusalem is troubled. Or maybe it was this. Maybe they were afraid of how Herod was going to react, knowing his past, thinking, if Herod thinks we're hiding a king to take his family's place, what is he going to do to us? I don't know what the reason is, but it says everybody's stressed. Herod and the whole city. And so what does Herod do? Well, he calls in some people in verse 4. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. Now, we've become very familiar with these people, this group of people, as we've gone through the parables of Jesus. We see them all the time. This would be the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests. Basically, it's the Sanhedrin. So he's called the great Sanhedrin together. And he inquires about the Christ, the Messiah. Remember, that's the same word. Christ and Messiah is just from two different languages. Messiah is the Hebrew word, Christ is the Greek word, and it means the anointed one. And so Herod, he's familiar with these customs and with these stories. He's no expert on the Old Testament or anything, but he knows about the Christ. And so he asks him, where's he going to be born? And they tell him in verses 5 and 6, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, which prophet wrote that and when? Well, the prophet Micah wrote that. 700 years before this happened, the prophet Micah wrote those words. And if you want to read it for yourself, I won't read it to save a little bit of time, but if you want to read that for yourself, you can go to Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and you'll find that's where that is. And so they tell him, he'll be born in Bethlehem. Now that's a seemingly insignificant place. The word Bethlehem, it means house of bread. So it was just an agricultural town. It wasn't very far away from Jerusalem, about 5 or 6 miles to the south is where you would find it. Remember, that's where the shepherds were in the area, keeping watch over their sheep. And a lot of those lambs were used in the temple sacrificial system. With a little irony there, isn't it? The lamb born in Bethlehem goes to the temple, sacrificed. You see a lot of parallels there with that. And so it's just a small, insignificant town. I think I read somewhere, don't quote me on this, but it seems like one time I read there might have been 1,000 people there in the town. And so what does Herod do now? He's troubled about this. Now he knows a location. He's narrowed it down to Bethlehem. So here's what he does in verses 7 and 8. And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and he ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Now we could say a lot of things about Herod, but he's no dummy. You couldn't call him a dummy. He's been masterful at killing anybody in his way over the course of his career. Anything that's been a threat to his power, he's always been able to squash. And he's a good liar. So he calls these people in by themselves. And you can only imagine, how he must have acted. In my mind, I tried to picture this, in my head. And so he's sitting there questioning him. So tell me, when did this star? When did you first see it? Because that's an amazing thing that you've seen this star. So where was it? When did you see it? And they tell him. And he says, well, you need to go and search for this king. You need to go and search for this child. We've got to find him. And then when you find him, make sure that you come right back. Because I need to know about this too. Because I also need to go and worship him. Now he's just told a whopper, hasn't he? A lie, a big lie. He doesn't want to worship him. He wants to kill him. And why would he want to know when that star appeared? He's trying to figure out how old the child is by when the star appeared. The Scripture does tell us that in verse 16. If you just glance down to verse 16 there in chapter 2, it says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men," they didn't come back to him, "he became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men." Does that mean Jesus was 2 years old by the time they got here? I don't know how old Jesus was. I don't know when the star appeared, if it was 2 years, or if Herod just used that as a buffer. Maybe he said, just to be safe, I'll bump it up to 2 years, and that way I'll make sure that I get him. I don't know. So I don't know how old Jesus was when the star appeared or when the wise men visited him, but it wasn't when he was born. We know that much. Some time has passed. And so the wise men, they do what Herod tells them to do. In verses 9 and 10, it says, "After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy." Now, this seems to imply, and I think this is correct, that they hadn't seen the star since they were in their own country that was in the east. And see, that's what it means there. We saw the star in the east. They're not saying that they saw the star in the east. They're saying their location when they saw the star. They were in an eastern country when they saw the star. That's what that means. Because if the star was in the east and they followed it in the east, well, they'd have gone to India. They wouldn't have gone to Jerusalem. So that's what that means. But now it's reappeared. And it's leading them to the exact place where the Christ child was. And that's why they're happy. Because it's appeared again. And remember, these people were astrologers. They studied the sky. So this was an interesting phenomenon of them. Now, there's a lot of speculation over this star. The Star of Bethlehem, as it's called. Some people have claimed it's a meteor. Some people have claimed it was a comet, a planet. Some people have claimed it was the conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Remember that 4 years ago? When the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn happened, the closest that it's been to Earth in over 800 years, and you could see it in the sky. I remember going out there and look at it. Like you could even see the rings of Saturn. It was amazing. And people called it the Christmas star. That was 4 years ago, December 21st, 2020 is when that happened. And so people were speculating, that this is what the wise men saw. Well, I don't think that's what it was. I don't know what it was, just to be honest. I don't know what the star was. Some people have claimed it was just the glory of God. Like with the shepherds in Luke 2 and 9, where it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were filled with great fear." And we see the glory of the Lord as blazing light in the Old Testament and the New Testament. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, it says that his face glowed from the glory of the Lord. That's in Exodus 34. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle in Exodus 40. Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord fill the temple in Ezekiel chapter 10. And the transfiguration, it says that Jesus' face shined like the sun and that his face were radiant like a bright light. The glory of the Lord. Paul, in his conversion in Acts chapter 9, the glory of the Lord blinded him. A bright light. Revelation chapter 1 with John, the glory of the Lord. So was that what it was? I don't know what it was. I tend to lean to that, I guess. I would probably lean to that theory. But I don't know what exactly the star was. But the Messiah is spoken of as a star in the Old Testament. In Numbers and in other places in the Bible. In Numbers 24 verse 17, it says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Now with the Magi, with their previous knowledge, maybe from Daniel, did they associate that scripture with this mysterious star that appeared? I don't know. Maybe. It's possible, I guess, because Jesus is referred to as the bright and morning star, is he not? Old and New Testament. And here's an example in the New Testament. Revelation 22 and 16. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things to the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star. So was it just the glory of the Lord? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate exactly what it was because it really doesn't matter exactly what it was. All we know is the wise men saw it. It reappeared to them. It led them to the exact place where Jesus was and rested over the place. And so I tend to believe also, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I tend to believe that they were the only ones that could see it. Now, I don't have any proof for that, but that's just a personal feeling that I have because Herod, he didn't seem to have any knowledge of seeing this in the sky or even the religious leaders. And so I tend to think that maybe only the wise men could see it, but that's not stated. And so they go to the house in verses 11 and 12. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. And so the star, it leads them directly to the house. Notice the terminology here. The house. And that Greek word right there, it simply means a residence. So this is the house of Joseph and Mary where they were staying. It's not the stable that the shepherds visited because some time has passed and now they're in a house. And what's the first thing they do when they go into that house? They fell down and worshipped him. Now, and that makes me think of this verse. They didn't sing this or quote these words because this is written much later, but Charles Wesley in his famous Christmas carol, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, speaking of Christ, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Hail the heaven-born Prince of Peace, hail the Son of Righteousness, light and life to all he brings, rising with healing in his wings. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. That's who this is. And notice they worshipped him, the child, not Mary, not Joseph, or any other thing. They worshipped the child. And they have brought him expensive gifts. And these are gifts for a king. You can go back, I won't read the scriptures but to save time, but you can go back in the Old Testament and see when people visit Solomon and some of these other people mentioned in the Old Testament that they would bring them gifts. And some of these same gifts mentioned here are mentioned in the Old Testament as gifts for kings. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So let's briefly look at those. Now gold, it needs no explanation, right? We know what gold is. Now if you don't know what gold is, just ask Brandon. He'll tell you all about it after church if you need to know what gold is. But we know it's a symbol of wealth. It's always been a symbol of wealth, of nobility, and royalty. It's gold. So we know that, even as Westerners. But frankincense, what is that? What is frankincense? Well, frankincense, it was expensive. And it was a beautiful smelling incense, a perfume, if you will. And it was used only for special occasions, kingly occasions, or maybe the wedding of a wealthy person. It might be used in something like that. It was used in Leviticus chapter 2. If you go and read the instructions that God gave Moses for the grain offerings that were to be made in the tabernacle. And then later in the temple, frankincense was used in the grain offerings. And what does the Bible say? That it created a sweet smelling aroma for the Lord. Frankincense was used in that. And it was said to be the incense of deity. The incense of deity in the ancient world. And then we have myrrh. Myrrh is also an incense, a perfume. It's not as expensive as frankincense, but it was still valuable. And it had a couple of uses. Sometimes they would mix it with wine and use as an anesthetic. Like a first aid kit. Or as we would call in the South, a salve. something like that. It was also used in preparation for bodies to be buried. We see that with Jesus' own body in John 19 and 39. And so the Bible doesn't say how they used these gifts or anything like that. They were expensive. So, one theory is that they might have used them to travel to Egypt when they had to flee to escape Herod's wrath. They might have used it to finance the trip, possibly because they were expensive. But the Bible doesn't really say if there was a purpose for them. But over time, Christians have come to look at these gifts as symbolic for Jesus in a certain way. Well, there's no... the Bible doesn't necessarily say that either, but a lot of time has passed here, 2,000 years, that we've had to look at these words and these stories and everything. And so for over time, these gifts have come to be symbolic for Christ in a certain way. The gold for his royalty as a king. The frankincense for his deity as God. And the myrrh for his humanity because he died. As he came to earth as a man. That's what we're celebrating this week. But for whatever they were for, they present the gifts. But then, what happens in verse 12? God warns them in a dream not to return to Herod. And then these magi disappear from the pages of Scripture. And that's it. And that's all we know about them, really. It's unique, isn't it? That God and his plan, why did he use these men, per se? These king makers from a foreign country to be a part of this story? I don't know. I don't know. But it's part of his plan, we know that, right? Or it wouldn't have happened. So that's the thing. He says, okay, so what's the point here? It is the story. This is as far as we're going to go. I don't have time to go into the rest of it today. And so what are we to take away from this? Are we just retelling the story? Or what do you want us to take away as we leave today about this particular story and this group of people? Well, this is what I want us to take away from it. I want us to focus, as we start to close this out, on the three different attitudes of these three players that we see in this version of the Christmas story. I want us to look at their responses to the birth of Christ. Herod's response. The religious leaders' response. And the Magi's response. That's what I want us to focus on. How did each respond to the birth of Christ? So let's take Herod first. Herod, he was troubled by this, wasn't he? We already talked about that. He responded with hatred and murder. That's how Herod responded to the birth of Christ. Hatred, death, murder. Now, a lot of time's passed, 2,000 years, but I want us to see today that people are responding the exact way that these three people are responding. It hasn't changed. Everybody's responding in one of these three ways to the birth of Christ or to Christ in general. Herod responded with hatred. Now, we see that all over the world that a response to Christ is hatred. I already talked a little bit about that. You can't even say the word Christmas, right? You cannot pray, or you can pray as long as you don't say what? Jesus. We had an issue with this right here in Double Springs at a football game this season. They were leading prayers at the football game, and we get a letter from the organization up in Wisconsin. I can't remember the name. Freedom from Religion organization. I can't remember their exact title. Don't really care, just to be honest. But yeah, we got a letter from them about public prayer. Now, if we were leading a Muslim prayer, do you think we'd have gotten a letter from them? Absolutely not. And the fact is, what we were told is you can still have the prayer as long as public officials or school officials don't lead it. The congregation can still do it pretty much as long as you don't say Jesus. You could say God, because that can mean many different things to different people. but you can't say Jesus. Hatred. So see, the modern world is still responding like Herod. Even the church world is responding like Herod. I saw a clip this week. YouTube is a good thing and it's a bad thing. But I saw just this week, don't know what affiliation it was, it doesn't matter. But he had on type robes and his sash, or whatever, specific term they use for it, I don't know. Well, it was rainbow colored. And he was claiming that that Mary was not a virgin when Jesus was born. And that's a man in a pulpit. And you know why they say that? Because they hate God. They hate Jesus. That's the only reason you make a statement like that, is out of hatred. So people are still responding like Herod to Jesus. That's evident. Let's go to the next group. The religious leaders. And we didn't talk about them much. They just come in and they tell Herod where Christ is going to be born. And then that's it. And so their response to me, is very apathetic. It's indifferent. They don't seem to be interested in this, in the story. Now you would think, if they were really looking for the Messiah to come and deliver them in their minds from the Romans, that's what they had in mind, that they would have at least wanted to investigate this. Okay, because you've got strange, wealthy, powerful men. They've come from a foreign land, and they seem to know more about the King of the Jews than they do. So they've got information that they don't have about the Messiah. Isn't that worth looking into? Maybe just do a little bit of investigation. But they didn't. Or at least there's no record that they did. So they just seem kind of like they just brushed it off. Well, whatever. Indifferent. Not interested. Now we do know what they did as an adult. To the adult Christ, they killed him. We know that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about right now. The child. Not interested. Not interested. Are there people like that today? Sure. There are plenty of people. They've grown up in the church. Maybe they went to church as a child, teenager, this and that. Go to college. And then they get out of college. They get married. They have kids. I'm just not interested in all the Jesus thing right now. I'm young. I just want to live my life. I just want to do this. I want to do that. I'm not interested in that. They're not necessarily hostile to it, but they're just not interested. That's just not for me now. That's for the old folks. When I get old and I've done everything I want to do, then I live for God. This kind of attitude. So people are still indifferent to Jesus today. They may even go to church. Parable of the sower describes all this perfectly. It even describes the Christmas story perfectly. Herod's response, hard path. The indifference of the religious leaders, the thorny ground, the rocky ground, right there. So there are plenty of people that are in churches that are not interested in Jesus. Plenty of folks like that. Because they go to the church just because it's a cultural thing, or they just go to please mom, or to please dad, or please Meemaw, or something like that. But they're not really interested in Jesus. Indifferent. Just like the religious leaders. And then we have the Magi. And what was their response? These foreigners worshipped him. They show up and worship him. So these are powerful men too. That can't be understated here. The power that these guys had. And they travel all of this way. Not to a palace, but to a normal residence in a farming town. And that didn't hinder them from going inside. These people probably lived in some type of fancy palace-like structure. That's probably what they were used to. And then they show up, that star leads them to this place. But that didn't deter them. They go right in and they worshiped him. And so there are still people today who honor Jesus, who honor him as their Savior because he has changed their minds. He has changed them. They are born again. And so they honor Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, are we outnumbered? Sure. But there are still people that respond like the Magi. And they honor the Lord and they worship Him. And I'm hoping that every person that's sitting here today is in that category. In the category of the Magi. But not to put us on a pedestal compared to everybody else. Because if I could use a Christmas allusion here, we were all like Ebenezer Scrooge at one point in our lives. Humbug to God. You know how Charles Dickens described Scrooge in his book? This is how he describes Scrooge in that famous book. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint. That's the description of Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, you don't have to raise your hand. But could you say, yeah, that's a pretty good picture of the way I used to be. A clutching, covetous, scraping, grasping old sinner, hard and sharp as flint. And so here's what I'll leave us with today. With this question. Going through all these responses, these three responses. So my question that I would leave to you, myself, everybody, is what are you right now? What are you this Christmas? Christmas 2024. Going into 2025. What are you right now? Are you like Herod? And you hate God? Are you like the Pharisees and the Sadducees? You're just indifferent? You're just not interested? Or are you like the Magi? And you honor Him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You see, everybody sitting here is in one of those categories. There's not another one. You either hate Him, indifferent, or you love Him. There's no other category. There's not a D choice. It's A, B, or C. You can say, well, if I'm honest with myself, I'm either the first or the second. And my response to that, if that's how you would answer the question, is I'm like Herod or I'm like those religious leaders, then my response to you is, well, that's what Christmas is all about. So you don't have to be like Herod. And you don't have to be like those religious leaders. You can be the Magi and honor Him as your Lord and Savior. And so that would be my prayer. If you examine yourself and you're looking at yourself today and you say, if I'm honest with myself, I'm one of the first two. I'm not the Magi. Then I'm not going to ask you to come to the front and make a confession of faith or anything like that. But I'm going to pray that you cannot get this out of your head when you leave. And I'm going to pray that God will plant that seed that we talked about a few weeks ago. Because once that seed is there, I don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything. If it's of God, it's eventually going to grow. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Are you Herod, the religious leaders? Or are you the Magi? And if we're in that last group that honor Him, then we can sing the words of this old Christmas carol right here that I wrote down. And it be the truth. And it be the truth. And I'll let you finish the last line when I get to it. But here's what it says. O Jesus, to Thee be all glory given. Word of the Father, now in flesh appearing. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. And I'll let everybody say the last line. Christ the Lord. And God bless you today. And I hope you have a Merry Christmas.